Thank you, Carson and Wyatt Roy. Thank you for joining Sky News Business. Now, you've just pointed out that in Israel, we're seeing about $3.2 billion in venture capital invested into startups. In Australia, it's only about $100 million. What's the government going to do to help give people incentives to actually invest more?
Well, I think it's an enormous problem for our country if we can't have particularly young people, but all people starting businesses, and the availability of capital is an enormous part of that. As I said, last year, we spent about $100 million on venture capital for startups, but we bet $200 million on the Melbourne Cup. So surely there's so much more we can do. There are simple things to help with this, things like crowdsourcing, obviously, that I think we can call low-hanging fruit, but I do think we should be more bold. In Israel, where there was no venture capital in the early 90s, they created a fund called Yozma, the government, $100 million on the table, $10 million from the government, $10 million from the private sector to create 10 venture capital funds. Today, Israel has the highest rate of venture capital per capita of any country on earth. The figures that I had recently was $170 per capita per person. In the US, it's only $70 per person. I just met a venture capital firm before I came here. They told me it was more like $450 per person. In Australia, it's about $5. So I do think there is a place. It's a big cultural shift. It's a big change, but where the government could partner with the private sector to help with venture capital and increasing the level of startup businesses we have in Australia.
You've just pointed out that it was the Israeli government who really took the lead on this. Doesn't that mean it's up to the Australian government to take the lead? Shouldn't you be putting your money where your mouth is on this issue?
Well, I agree with you. I do think we should. I think that's a controversial.
Does Joe Hockey agree with you?
Well, Joe said some very supportive things about what happens in Israel and the Office of the Chief Scientist, which administers this funding in Israel. And I'm a backbench member. I'm not a member of the cabinet. So what I can say is I've certainly raised this issue many times with the Prime Minister, with the Treasurer, with the Small Business Minister, with the Assistant Treasurer, with the Communications Minister. And I do think there is a recognition that if we are going to have a prosperous nation into the future, a big part of that is about fostering a startup culture and where people can have successful companies started, and that's where you create the jobs. PwC, where we are today, they did a report with Google that said if we get this right, it can represent 4% of GDP and over half a million jobs, over 500,000 jobs for the future of our country, off a base of only 0.2% of GDP today. So I really do think that there could be a role for the government, provided that is with the private sector. So every dollar of taxpayers' money that's expended should be partnered with private money, in my mind. But if Israel can do it in the early 90s, if many other countries in South Korea, we've seen over $1 billion invested in this recently, directly citing the Israeli example. I think the Australian government can do that, should do that, and I'm calling on my colleagues and working with them to try and achieve that.
There was criticism of the negotiations over the higher education reforms, that a lot of damage was done between the government and the research sector. With the protracted negotiations, we saw a lot of people leave Australia, apparently, anecdotally, because they weren't sure about their funding. How severe was that damage, and how does the government correct its relationship with the research sector to get these jobs of the future?
Look, I think it's a huge challenge for us, and what it shows is that reform is so difficult, but we should never shy away from that opportunity. So there is a real potential for us to get this right. So the deregulation that the government put forward is an important part of that, to ensure that we have the world's best universities and we're competing. It's already our second biggest export, and we don't want to limit that potential. But the other thing I think that we can do is we get the private sector partnering with higher ed. And one of the weird things about this country, I think, is we do really, really good research, but we're not achieving that commercialisation. And around the world, and I'll use the Israeli example again, but it's true in places like Stanford as well, you have private companies based at universities with members of the university on the board that essentially do that commercialisation of the amazing IP that they create. In Israel, it's Technion University and Weizmann Institute that are creating things that have changed the world for the better. And I think that part of our reform package that we were talking about is important, but if we could do things like that where we partner the private sector with the higher education sector to achieve that commercialisation, it would be a great benefit to our country, because we're already coming up with the great ideas. We're just not turning into prosperity, jobs and money.
You've also mentioned the $1 trillion plus that we have currently sitting in superannuation. You kind of implied that money was being a bit lazy. It wasn't being used in venture capital. Your former colleague, well, for your time, Peter Costello is coming out and basically telling both sides of the political spectrum to hands off superannuation. We shouldn't be touching it. Do you think that's fair enough? And any future changes to superannuation we should be very wary of?
Yeah, well, I love Peter Costello. And he manages the Future Fund that actually does do these sorts of things. So I think that's actually a little bit hypocritical to say that the Future Fund can do it, but superannuation cannot. If you are an older Australian about to hit retirement who hasn't been having superannuation their entire working life, I agree. Superannuation should be left exactly the same. It should be in secure investments with, a safe return. But if you're my age and you've been paying superannuation since your first job when you're 15, and let's say you've been working in the mines or in the military, you're going to have a pretty large superannuation account pretty early on. Why shouldn't a percentage of that, not all of it, but a small percentage of that, go to Australian innovation and entrepreneurship? And obviously that does carry greater risk. But if you're 20 or 25, you can bear that risk and perhaps have a much bigger return, and obviously that would unlock an enormous amount of capital to help Australian innovation and entrepreneurship. So it's almost impossible to regulate this way, but there is a debate around superannuation that focuses on people about to hit retirement. Very important. I agree with Peter Costello's remarks there, but for people my age and how that superannuation is managed, I think that has to look different. And it is possible, it's not easy, but it's possible to have a look at that and see what we can change from government's perspective to help facilitate that.
Now, you also mentioned your desire to see Australia to be more welcoming to high net worth or highly intelligent foreign immigration. We've had the ACTU come out and say that Australia needs to actually be curbing its immigration intake. Now, at a time when we have an unemployment rate with a 6 at the start of that number and potentially higher to go, isn't that right, that we should be concentrating on making sure that there's jobs for the Australians already here as opposed to bringing new people in from overseas?
No, I completely disagree, because if you have a really smart, intelligent, capable person who brings a new skill set and particularly capital to Australia to establish businesses in Australia, then they create more jobs. So, for example, many parts around the world have this, but there's no reason why you can't have a successful entrepreneurial visa system that says if you bring a certain amount of money and you're investing in Australian VC, Australian companies, Australian incubators, then we could perhaps look at things like residency for 5 years, which is a very hard thing for people to achieve. And what that does is directly create Australian jobs, exactly the thing you're trying to achieve. And we give that capital that we need to get that job creation happening here in Australia. So I would actually argue the exact opposite, saying if we are bringing people who are investing in Australian companies, creating Australian jobs, building that opportunity, we are a nation based on immigration, and we should be the hub for the smartest, brightest, most capable people across the planet to come here and to create that prosperity.
And just quickly, a lot of business people tell us that they've been very disappointed with the government's performance so far. Is this Joe Hockey's last budget if he doesn't get the settings right?
Look, I think that this is a very important budget for the government. Joe Hockey would be the first person to admit that. It's important not for our political survival. It's important for the future of the country. The world is changing. We've seen the coming off the iron ore prices. We see the changes with technology disruption and what that means for the future of our economy. But we have enormous opportunity as well with the 1 billion people coming into the middle class in Asia. And there is a question for us as a country. Do we take hold of that opportunity? Do we prepare ourselves for the long term and make some of those difficult reform decisions? Or do we relegate ourselves to mediocrity and basically try and stop the future from happening? So it's important for Joe, it's important for the Liberal Party, but more importantly, this budget's important for our country, and let's get it right.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining Sky News Business.
Thanks so much.